Angelina is a highly experienced professional with a background spanning over 20 years in financial services, marketing, technology, and design. With a track record of excellence, she has earned her CFP, COU, CHS, and EPC designations. She is known for providing financial advisors with investment and insurance content on their latest digital marketing strategies to grow their business. At Financial Tech Tools, Angelina combines her knowledge and expertise to provide advisors with digital marketing solutions, which can help them save hours creating content for their websites. This offering has positioned Financial Tech Tools as a leading provider in the digital marketing space, working with hundreds of advisors across the country. She has been recognized for her outstanding achievements, and she's been featured as one of the top 50 women influencers in Canada in the Insurance and Investment Journal. Angelina holds a position on both the Advocates Greater Vancouver chapter and the Advocates Technology Innovation Committee. Angelina, take it away.
Thank you, Andre. And special thanks for all of you for attending today. So we've got a whole bunch of questions, and it's going to be a little bit of a variety of questions, Carol.
Sounds good.
So let's start off with housing, because it's such a
Because I'm in Vancouver, so
yeah. So, well, in BC, we know that housing costs are a significant problem. There was a recent report actually from the National Bank of Canada that showed that it's actually even tougher for people to afford homes nowadays. Now, the report said that there are many current homeowners that are having a hard time, and some of these folks aren't even sure if they'll manage to buy a home. So, and one of the reasons that were listed was difficulty is the increase in interest rates. So how concerned are you for Canadians who have, obtained mortgages with lower interest rates, but now must renew with much higher rates in the near future, in the next upcoming years and months?
Yeah, good question. So, I think the first thing I'd say is we are acutely aware that the pressure that higher interest rates are putting on Canadians, and particularly new home buyers or aspiring home purchasers. Mortgages are one of the first places you see monetary policy start to work. Most of us buy a house on credit, and really what monetary policy is designed to do is affect the use of credit in the economy. So mortgages are sort of one of the first places you see monetary policy and one of the places you see it the strongest. So we pay close attention to the mortgage market. What I would add, though, is some important context. In Canada, a little below 40% of people have a mortgage, and then there's about 25% who own their home outright, and then there's a big chunk in the middle that rent. And so it is important to focus on the mortgage market. But what I would say is, at the bank, we focus on the entire economy and all Canadians. And so right now, the thing that people tell us that is the toughest on their financial situation is inflation. So inflation is certainly affecting people who have a mortgage, and it's affecting the 60% who don't have a mortgage too. So I think the most important thing we can do to support Canadians who are struggling with the pressure of the current financial situation is to get inflation back down. And when we get inflation back to target, well on its way to target, we can move from a fairly restrictive stance on interest rates and hopefully get back to a more sort of neutral stance, which will also help people with mortgages, and it will help aspiring home buyers too.
So that actually leads quite well into my next question with regards to first-time home buyers. So at the start of the pandemic, the interest rates were lowered to really spur on lending. And as a result of that, there were increased home prices, and yet with the Bank of Canada rate increases, we haven't seen the home prices drop. And really for those Canadians who are still looking to buy their first home, with higher interest rates and having a reduced borrowing power of about up to 40% in some cases, and housing prices that have remained elevated. Could you explain to us why some prices have remained elevated? And also, does the Bank of Canada actually consider the impact of higher interest rates on mortgage qualification?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you're seeing across Canada, in some sense, is what this city has experienced for probably 15 or 20 years now. So I know back when I was working here in Vancouver in the financial sector about 15 years ago, we were at that time worried about housing affordability. And there was a strong sense that one of the things that was affecting housing affordability was the number of buyers from outside Vancouver, either people migrating from other parts of Canada or from outside of Canada. And so there were a number of steps taken to affect that source of demand for housing, right? Housing prices stayed elevated. So, I mean, you know, what you had now and what you still have in Vancouver is a huge demand for housing and a constrained amount of supply. Now, of course, you combine that over the last 15 years, as I talked about, a period of low interest rates. So low interest rates usually mean house prices go up, and anything that you buy on credit sort of has an inverse relationship to interest rates. So the combination of those two things kept housing prices up. And then, of course, we entered a pandemic, and both of those factors are accentuated. We have an even greater demand for housing. We're all locked in our houses for days on end, so we want more house or different houses or a different location. And we have even lower interest rates. And so we had a real run up in house prices, on average 50% across Canada. Now, we've had a big increase in interest rates since then, so you would have anticipated maybe erasing all of that gain, but we haven't. And I think, you know, our view on that is what we have is a structural supply problem. So we can move interest rates around, it will have some effect, but really what we need to address is the supply problem. So, you know, again, going all the way back to you know, the dynamics here in this market, we've taken a number of policy actions over the years to affect demand for housing, and we still have a housing affordability issue. So, you know, we are really glad to see the degree of attention this is getting from all levels of government, and we need some coordination on that, we need some action. I think if we can address the supply issue, that's our best route to housing affordability.
Thank you, Carolyn. Now, just to change gears a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about a recent poll that was conducted by Advocates for Financial Literacy Month. Now, in that poll, over 40% of respondents actually indicated that their clients have been late to make a monthly credit card or mortgage payments. And 47% of those respondents indicated that they've actually seen clients get a loan to purchase or refinance a car. And some even went as far as selling personal items to help support their monthly bills. Now, because Advocates is an association of financial advisors, our members handle the finances of many Canadians. And numerous advisors have actually noticed that a lot of their clients are really struggling. And one of our advisors has actually said he's seeing a lot more pain than what the government suggests. So why does it sometimes seem like the government inflation figures and the economy doesn't match what regular people are going through in Canada?
Yeah. Well, as much as we roll all the data up into one CPI number, no two people experience inflation the same way. Every household is different, right? So if you're feeding a family of 4 or 5 kids, you're buying a lot more groceries than somebody who's just a single person, for example. If you're commuting 2 or 3 hours every day, you're buying a lot more gas than somebody who just walks to work. If you're renting, you've seen your rent go up 15, 16%. Your interest payments have gone up, your variable debt. So it really, it really depends on what your basket of goods is the term we use in commerce. What your basket of goods is. That's how you experience inflation. And so, we've seen some of the most sticky inflation we've seen is in food. And we all buy food. Nobody can avoid buying food, right? Yeah, yeah. So I think, you can look at the headline number, and I guess I think that it does not feel like 3.8 to me. I still feel like prices are going up a lot, and it really depends on, what is your what is your basket? What is your experience with inflation? So I think that's one answer. The other answer, and I think it's important, you talked about a survey, and you heard me in my speech talk about, we look at what we call credit stress indicators, which are sort of, they're really more about the loan, not the person who has the loan. So the loan could be completely up to date, but the borrower can be feeling very stressed. And you'll get that in a survey. You might not get that in stress indicators, credit stress indicators. I mean, people are making tough choices, so they could be completely up to date on all of their payments, and they're not going to show up if we're just looking at credit stress indicators, they're not going to show up necessarily. But that's why I think the surveys we do, we pay attention to the surveys that the organizations like you do too, because that tells us how people are feeling.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about small business and productivity.
Let's do that.
Yes. So as of 2021, small business employed 8.2 million individuals in Canada, and that's 2/3 of the total private labor force. So a lot of us in here are small business owners, myself included. I can see so many business owners in the room. And Governor Tiff Macklem talked about the need to increase our productivity and how each person in our country doesn't actually generate as much economic output per capita. And we have a nation that is actually weak in national productivity and low in capital investment compared to the G7 and OECD nations. This is not news to you, I'm sure. So how can the Bank of Canada work with the federal and provincial governments to change our country's focus away from mainly being a destination perhaps for education where it causes a lot of people to leave, or spending too much on expensive housing that doesn't really contribute much to the economy? Instead, how can we actually encourage people to invest in new ideas, businesses, prioritize innovation, and improve our nation's productivity? What can we do to close that gap?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, productivity is that really important ingredient that raises everybody's standard of living. It's how we build wealth as a country. It's how we get ahead. And in an environment where the labor market is tight, we have upward pressures, productivity becomes that much more important. Productivity pays for higher wages. It's a really, really important ingredient to grow the economy. Through the pandemic, there were lots of things that were getting in the way of productivity in all forms of businesses. So we were really optimistic when we came out of the pandemic that we might see sort of a surge in productivity. We haven't seen that yet, and it's perplexing really, because we have a lot of the foundations in Canada for better productivity. We have a highly educated population, we have high labor force participation, but as you pointed out, we don't have the level of investment we need in machinery and equipment, in innovation, in training, that sort of thing. So it is an important area that we need governments to focus on, particularly if we're going into a period where we have tight labor markets and things like that. This is really the solution that we need, to build wealth and to build prosperity for Canadians. The bank, we don't have a lot of direct tools to affect productivity. We talk about it a lot. When the governor and I are talking to parliamentarians at the Senate or House Finance Committee, this topic comes up. We're always glad to talk about it. But a central bank's tools are really more designed to target demand in the economy, and boosting productivity really requires building up the supply side of the economy. So we'll keep talking about it. I'm glad to hear you're talking about it, but it does need to be a focus going forward.
Especially for us all as business owners in this group here. It's encouraging to know that you guys are very focused on that. Just a follow-up, how does the arrival of over 1 million new people into our country, how does that impact productivity?
Well, let me maybe step back from productivity specifically and just talk about the effects of immigration on the economy more broadly. It's difficult to sort of parse it out and say immigration affects any one factor in a particular way. But I mean, immigration does really two things. First, and really importantly, it brings in added workers, and we've had a really tight labor market. So businesses need to bring in labor from outside of contribute, we're good in Canada too at integrating people into the workforce. So that's a plus. That adds to supply. But of course, when people come in to the country, they need to buy homes. They need healthcare, they need education, they need all of the things. So they add also to demand. And there's a bit of a timing difference too. When they first come in and they're getting settled in the country, there is a big boost to demand. And then gradually, as they're integrated into the workforce, they add to the supply too. So there can be a timing difference. Just back to your first question though on productivity, what we do know in Canada is we are better at growing by adding people. We are not as good at boosting the productivity on a per person basis. And so if we could be both, if we could be good at both things, we'd really have some magic there, right? So we really need to work on the types of investments that help individual employees become more productive. And that's, additional training, investments in technology, in equipment, that kind of thing.
Thank you. We're switching gears a lot today, but that's because we have a limited amount of time to do. Let's talk a little bit about digital currency. Now, I know that the bank has been looking into a digital version of a Canadian dollar, or CBDC. What's the latest on this project?
Yeah, glad to talk about that. What I'd start with doing is sort of going back to some of the lesser known things that the Bank of Canada does. I mean, I think everybody's been kind of focused on our role as monetary policy. And today I was talking a little bit about financial stability, but the other really important job we have for Canadians is making sure that we keep pace globally with payment options. So we produce the banknotes that you have in your wallet, if you have bank. Not everybody has banknotes in their wallet anymore, but that is one of the forms of payment we look after. We also, I was telling some folks down at the table just before we got going today, we're also responsible for all of the payment infrastructure that you never see, you never think about it. It's all the technology, the kind of plumbing that makes sure your payments that are happening every day, day in, day out, are settling and clearing and that kind of thing. So our job is to be thinking, 5 to 10 years ahead about how Canadians want to pay. And what we've seen for sure over the last few years is Canadians increasingly want to pay with digital forms of payment. So, and you sort of think, well, I've got lots of options already. I've got 4 or 5 cards in my wallet. I almost never use cash. I have lots of digital options to pay. But you don't have, at this point, an option to pay that's digital, that's equivalent to cash, so that has some of the benefits that cash has, but is digital. So that's really what we're exploring. It is out there. It's not, like I said, most Canadians sort of look at us with kind of a puzzled look and say, well, I already paid digitally. I don't need another digital option. So we just did a big, broad consultation with Canadians. We had a high level of response. And really the goal there was to ask Canadians, if you were to think about using a digital form of cash, what would it need to look like? How would it need to work to be appealing to you? So, and really what Canadians told us is it has to be a lot like cash. It has to have the convenience, the privacy, all the things that I like about my cash would have to be preserved if you went forward with a digital form of cash. So that was really good feedback. That'll help guide the research that we do. The bottom line is the decision to issue a digital form of the Canadian dollar isn't a decision that the Bank of Canada makes. It's made by Parliament, so it's really made by you through your parliamentarians. So Canadians will decide if we want or need a digital Canadian dollar. Our job is to do the research and the development and the thinking around it so that if they do make that decision, we're ready.
So very interesting because that wasn't quite on my radar until my more recent research. So thank you for sharing that with us. Let's talk a little bit about quantitative tightening. So on October the 25th, it was stated that the Bank of Canada will continue with their policy of quantitative tightening. What needs to happen for the Bank of Canada to consider quantitative easing again?
Well, quantitative easing is really, we would think of it as sort of an emergency tool, an extraordinary tool. The pandemic was the first time the bank used that emergency tool. So really what what quantitative easing is when interest rates are already at sort of their lower boundary level, and we want to sort of keep them there or push long-term interest rates out, we actually go out and buy bonds in the market, and that extra purchasing, that extra demand out there helps keep interest rates lower. We're not in that world anymore. We're not at the effective lower bound, and we're not in an emergency situation. So those are not conditions under which we would be using quantitative easing. In fact, where we are now is back to sort of normalizing our balance sheet. So all those bonds that came onto our balance sheet through the quantitative easing phase are now maturing and rolling off. So we call that quantitative tightening. So.
And then in the latest monetary policy report, it was again mentioned that inflation might return to target around mid-2025. Now, given the uncertainties and revisions in the economic outlook, how confident are you in this time frame? And with this in mind, can you provide us insights into when the Bank of Canada, I know you're smiling, you know what question I'm going to ask, when the Bank of Canada will actually consider putting a halt to interest rate hikes, and any potential timeline for lowering interest rates in the future? I can see totally.
I knew I wasn't getting out of the room without that
I
question.
know.
Exact dates.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah, we'd love to have exact dates, but we know that.
Yeah.
You know what, let's just turn off that webcast. And then you tell us in secret.
So look, for sure it's been a tough forecasting environment these last couple of years. But every time we put out a monetary policy report, you have our best forecast with all of the information we had at that time. So the forecast that you cited, that is our best forecast. What we did also say, though, is the risks to inflation have increased a bit. But having said that, we are seeing monetary policy starting to work. We are seeing the sort of underlying forces of inflation starting to reduce. The economy is coming back into balance, supply and demand balance, so that the pressure on prices is easing. We're seeing we were seeing sort of pretty accelerated wage increases earlier in the year. That's starting to come off. We're seeing corporate pricing behavior starting to normalize a bit. So there's lots of signs there that we're well on our way. What we need to see, though, is we need to see those signs start to translate into core inflation coming down. We really need to see that number start to come down. As we said in our forecast, we think that's going to take a while. We need a bit of patience. We think it's going to hover around 3 or just above 3 into early next year, and then start to head back to the 2% target in 2025. But there's risks with that, for sure. We are not yet talking about reducing rates. We need to see inflation well on its way back to its target. Monetary policy is forward-looking, so we don't need to see it go all the way back to 2% before we're going to start talking about reducing rates. But we do need to see and be confident that momentum is going in the right direction. And the good news, as I said earlier, is when we get there, when we do see inflation well on its way back to target, that's when we'll start talking about moving from a more restrictive policy stance, higher rates back to something more. But we're just not there yet.
Thank you. And just our final question for our fireside chat, so if you guys have questions ready, please get yourselves ready for our live Q&A. What's the most important thing you want everyone in the room to remember from our discussion today?
Well, I'd probably use maybe an overused phrase over the last couple of years, but we're heading for a new normal. We've had to do a lot of new normal over the last few years. New normal about how we work, new normal about travel, all kinds of things. We're definitely in a new normal financially too. So you guys have a really, really important job to work with your clients and help them prepare and think about an environment where interest rates are higher than we've seen and we've gotten used to in the last 15 years. So it was a real privilege to be able to speak with you, and looking forward to hearing from you. But that would be for this group. That's the important thing I want you to take away is please use that privileged role you have with your clients to help them adjust and prepare to a future where we may have a higher interest rate environment.
Well, thank you, Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn, for all your insights. So at this point, we will now move on into the live Q&A. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And oh, we've got questions already. So, and we've got Suzanne and Cecilia. So and that will be coming to you with the mic. And then prior to asking your question, if you could please state your name and affiliation, that would be great. Go ahead, Tony.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. Tony Chang with Desjardins Investments. Question is lag time. We talked a little bit about increasing interest rates and what the lag time is. What we're seeing is maybe a potential softer or mild recession. We have a lot of small businesses that may teeter over the next 12 months. If we do see that teeter into more of a normal recession, and we see the Bank of Canada starting to cut rates because we're experiencing that across the board, what is the lag time for those small business people or entrepreneurs to come back into the market, start to deploy more capital and hire more people?
Yeah, I mean, lag time is something we've talked a lot about over the last years. We raised rates quite aggressively. And normally we think of the lag time for monetary policy to be something around 18 months. So if you think about sort of the path of interest rates, we've still got, as I said in my speech, we've still got some tightening to come, we think. There's a number of things that we think have had an impact on what would be a normal lag time for monetary policy. Through the pandemic, Canadians actually built up some excess savings. So I think that has, we think that's buffered a bit the effect of interest rates on people. Here in Canada, we have more fixed rate mortgages. Now, we did see an uptick in variable rate mortgages through the pandemic. So those the transition tends to be quicker. But, we're looking at that pipeline of mortgages I mentioned in my speech. So we know there's still half of the stock of mortgages out there haven't renewed yet. So there is a lot of lag time. And your question about when do people sort of go out and come back in, that's a difficult question for us to answer. I mean, I think what we're watching for, and we're trying to be forward-looking as we think about policy. So we don't wait to see everything materialize. We look for those indicators, and we try and sort of react in a forward-looking manner.
Thank you. Yes,
My name is Kathy Halbert. I'm a financial planner with many designations and with Insante. And I'm an activist member. Thank you for putting this event on. As you well know, Canadians have a substantial amount of their personal wealth tied up in their homes. And I keep hearing the federal government, and you said today, affordable housing. And I would like to know if anybody has thought about the impact of the existing homeowners. Not that they should have priority over people who don't yet have homes, but I think that affordable housing will result in a lot of our clients losing substantial wealth in their homes, housing prices actually coming down. And I don't think that the Canadians understand that's maybe the result of that sort of progress. So I think we should be preparing our clients for that. I'd like your comments.
I think I'd say I agree with you. We talked about the effect on home prices of changes in interest rates. We would normally have anticipated quite a bit bigger change in house prices given the change in interest rates we've seen. We haven't seen that, and as I said, I think that's in large part because we have a structural supply problem. It's going to take a while to fix that supply problem. We do expect house prices will likely come off a bit more. But I think your point is to the degree that people view their wealth through the lens of their home value, that's an important thing to consider for people like you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Keith Brown.
Hi there, that's my name. Thanks. increase in wages for the auto workers in any union negotiation ever in history. So wage pressure is huge. We have taxation going on gasoline, so 13 cents a liter here, that goes through the whole economy. So I am curious how you calculate taxes into our inflation figures, because it's definitely feeding in there. Every time a truck drives my lettuce across town, that's charging me more money. And then, so I don't know if you can even answer these questions, but financial stability in the era of higher interest rates. If you look at the U.S. mortgage market, where I can get a 30-year mortgage at a fixed rate, and I know exactly what my financial impact is going to be for like a long period of time. We have variable rates and variable 5-year fixed rates, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year mortgages. Try to get a 10-year mortgage for a residential mortgage is nearly impossible. Nearly impossible. So, you know, I think there's some reform needs to happen in the mortgage business so that we could have more stability in the era of higher interest rates. But could you answer the question about how tax fits into your calculations of inflation?
Yeah. Okay, I think there was about 3 different things in there. There was wages, lettuce being transported, and okay. So the taxes. So to answer your question very directly, we take all fiscal policy, all government budgets, all tax policy, all of the policies that are announced in public, and they get fed into our forecast, including our forecast for inflation. So, but I think there's been a lot of discussion on this issue of the carbon tax and how that works. What's important to keep in mind, and I think this is the point you're making, is there's sort of two layers of effects. We call it sort of first round, second round effects. So there is the direct taxation effect on purchasing something like home fuel. This is the big debate right now, right? But the point that you're making is that that tax then becomes a cost for a business who uses transportation, for example, as one of their input costs. And then that adds to other input costs they have, and as it goes up, that business now needs to potentially pass on that added cost in the form of the price of their lettuce or whatever it is they're transporting, right? So there is first round and second round effects on something like commodities for sure, particularly oil and transportation costs. Absolutely. The first round effects are much easier to measure. The second round effects are sort of what we call that kind of sort of that's the more sticky part of inflation. Somebody was asking me earlier, what is sticky inflation? It's when those sort of first round effects, those shocks that happen as a jump in oil price, start to trickle down and affect everything else, all the other input costs in the economy. So that's obviously more difficult to measure.
We have a question from Laurent here.
Hi, Laurent Meunier from Pacific Financial. I'm also on the Advocates board here. Thanks for your time, and thanks to everyone else who got up early and joined us today and bought a ticket. Keep buying tickets. You were talking about the CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies, and you mentioned in there that Canadians had really said privacy is a huge concern on that.
Yeah.
And as we saw a couple of years ago, there was a big national protest, and a lot of those protesters were negatively affected through their mortgages and through their finances and trying to go after them financially. How can we ensure that the privacy and no political meddling happens in the programming of a CBDC, which can be programmed? So how do you ensure that if I protest the wrong thing, somebody can't just push a button and erase me?
Yeah. So I mean, that's the design challenge that Canadians have put to us, right? So, we, as I said, we went and talked to Canadians about the concept of a digital dollar, and that was one of the concerns they said. I mean, one of the reasons I use cash is that I can maintain my privacy. There's no sort of record of me using the cash. So that's what the Canadians have told us. So that's the challenge we have now. Can we design a a digital version of cash that preserves the things that Canadians want about the cash.
And then how strong is the firewall between the Bank of Canada and some up-and-coming politician who's got an idea of how they want it to be, which would come from some sort of like ideological reasoning of, you know, this person is bad or whatever they're buying is bad, so we're going to shut them down, but this person is good and what they're buying is good, so, you know, maybe they get a higher interest rate program into their CBDC, and these guys, maybe theirs expire if they don't spend it in X amount of time, or if they're, you know, buying cigarettes versus buying lettuce.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're asking me a question as though it's been built, and we haven't built a digital dollar yet.
Well, it's been built in some countries.
It has not been built in Canada. So it's difficult for me to answer a question, but I mean, I think what we've heard loud and clear from Canadians is that the level of interest I'm going to have in using a digital dollar will depend on whether you can preserve the things that I like about cash. So, you know, that was good feedback for us. We've got a design challenge. And again, as I said, at the end of the day, we don't decide to implement a digital dollar. That's a decision that's made by Canadians through their parliamentarians.
Thank you. We have a question over here. Hi, it's Barbara Lee with Hub Financial Hub Capital. I have a question. As an advisor, we've been told that the first generation is the generation that makes the money. The second generation is one that spends it, and very little is going to be left over for the third generation. So we've been told that there's about $1 trillion that's going to change hands to the second generation that may dissipate it all. When we're talking about productivity, how do we maintain that next generation of this wealth transfer is actually going to keep Canada competitive and, you know, at least maintain the productivity and not just dissipate all that wealth and keep Canada being productive? Are there monetary policies that you can think of to put in place, or is that, you know, Minister of Finance? How do we keep productivity and not have it dissipate that wealth?
Well, if I try and sort of combine the things inside your question there, I mean, I think what I would say is, if I use your model where there's a generation of wealth transfer, and we want to use that generational wealth transfer to address this challenge of productivity, I guess I would come down to what does that wealth transfer get spent on, right?
Yeah.
You know, there are things that will contribute more to productivity than other things. What can monetary policy do? As I said, you know, monetary policy is not really well designed to affect levels of productivity. We have an effect on the demand side of the economy. We really need to focus on the supply side of the economy. I would come back to the responsibility of Angelina. I mean, you know, what we're doing is trying to continue to talk about this issue, continue to raise awareness. When we get to talk to people like you, when we talk to parliamentarians, so that's what we can contribute. And the other thing we can contribute is, and we know, I mean, you're small business owners. One of the things you need to make investments in productivity is certainty, and steady, stable, low inflation is an important part of that certainty to invest. So the biggest contribution we can make to boosting productivity in Canada is to do our job and get inflation back to target, which is what we're going to do.
Thank you, Carolyn. We have a question here. Sorry, Brandon's first, and then we'll go to you next.
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for sharing some time today, and great job up there, Angelina. It's Brandon Chapman, founder of SAS Wealth Insurance. And back in July of 2020, Tip Macklin said rates are low and they're going to be low for a long time. Many families and businesses made financial decisions based on those comments. Is there any liability with the Bank of Canada on comments that are made? And secondly, how does the Bank of Canada define a long time? Thank you.
Great. I mean, I think the best way I can answer that question here, Brandon, is to take you back to the time where we made those comments, where the governor made those comments, right? So at that point in time, we had about 3 million Canadians unemployed. We had another 3 million Canadians who were underemployed, who didn't have as much work as they wanted and needed. We had the sharpest downturn in a generation. We we were staring down what we thought was going to be an deflationary spiral. We had a pandemic and no prospect at that point of a vaccine. So we did, the decisions we made were to support an economy that had effectively been shut down. So we did what we did at the time. I don't think we regret making those decisions at the time. 2 years was a long time for interest rates to be at the level they were. The good news is it worked. The Canadian economy, the world economy rebounded, the Canadian economy rebounded. We're out the other end. There's definitely some impacts that we need to deal with. We're doing that now.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Floyd,
Sorry, we have 1 minute left, so Floyd, it's got to be short and sweet. Sorry.
Well,
Don't ask about productivity.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Carolyn in her new role, because I've worked with you when you were in the BC Securities Commission and other roles that you had.
Okay.
So it's good to see you now that Ottawa is recognized now. But as a person who has 250 employees, I am facing with the problem that all my employees have a vision of inflation that's just like I encountered in the 1970s, which was ahead of what you were. They're thinking 10%, you're showing 4. So when I do my payroll adjustments for next year, I have to deal with not your number, but the number they have in their head. So here's the issue I have, where, in order to stop that trend, which you're not stopping at the moment, not in the minds of the vast majority of employees, there were 3 things that happened in the 1970s, and those of you who are under 60, it was a history lesson. Those of us who lived through it, I'm talking reality, and it's very, very simple. 3 things happened. A substantial reduction in real estate values. In Vancouver, do the arithmetic, 30 to 40% assessment adjustment in 1 year. The second thing was massive unemployment. Because if there's unemployment, why are you asking for a raise? And the third thing is governments had to reduce the amount of spending. So how are we going to get over those 3 things? Because that's the only thing that stopped inflation at that time, those 3 things. It was caused by interest rates, but all those other things had to happen in order to get inflation, and we had the benefit of 40 years. So do you see any of those 3 things happening? Dramatic drop in real estate. If developers start collapsing, it's going to happen. Secondly, unemployment, because if people stop, if construction slows down, lots of unemployment. Thirdly, you're going to see how do you convince governments to stop borrowing money and inflating the economy?
So, Carolyn,
We're on time, right? Well, I'll give you a really short answer. Yeah, we are seeing the economy moderate. We are seeing monetary policy is having an effect. We are seeing the economy get back into a better balance of supply and demand, and we are seeing inflationary pressures come off. There's some similarities to the time you talked about. There's lots of differences too. So we are not forecasting the things you talked about, but we are expecting the economy to moderate, and we are expecting that moderation to help get inflation back down the rest of the way.
thank you. Thank you so much. This
Thank you.
really
Thanks for your time.
Also, I want to say thank you for coming all the way to Vancouver, Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn. You're coming to Advocates Vancouver, and honestly, we really appreciate your time and your insights. So thank you very much. And just for the rest of us here in the room, we are going to take a short break for about 10 minutes, and we will continue on with the rest of our day here with our Platinum Chapter Sponsor presentations from PPI and Canada Life. So see you shortly after the break. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.